starting my presentation, let me introduce myself briefly because this is a very good opportunity to let you know about me. So here is a brief background. Here is a brief overview of my background. I'm currently a professor of Chuo University, but I think my career path somewhat unique background. So as you can see here, so after I graduated from master course, I did not go up to the PhD program directly. Once I started working at a Japanese think tank. So in the think tank, so I was responsible for business research and consulting services, especially in the manufacturing sectors. Particularly, my major is electronics and automobiles. Then through the various projects, I accumulated my skills and created a business network with industries in Japan. And while working at the think tank, so I restarted my PhD program and obtained PhD in 2010. Then soon after, I luckily got the position at the university, Yokohama City University, and changed my career. Since then, I have been engaged in academic research and education. So I have a background as an industrial economist. So today I'm going to talk about this issue from the perspective of industrial economists. Okay, let's go to the next page. So this is today's contents. So at first, I'll explain an outline of economic security. This is the main agenda of today. Actually, economic security, this word includes various meanings and implications. So I will introduce what discussion we have in Japan regarding economic security. And next, I will take a review about development process of Japan's semiconductor industry. So it was growing rapidly towards 1980s, but after late 1980s, it went through the declining process to the present. So I would like to examine this rise and fall process. And next, I will check the current position of Japanese semiconductor industry through various statistics. So we will confirm the fact that Japan's process scaling remains 40 nanometer and lags with Korea and Taiwan. Meanwhile, Japan still have a competitiveness in the upstream industries. And next, so I'm going to examine the validity of the current industrial revitalization strategy. This is the main issue of my presentation. So in particular, so actually, at the moment, the Japanese government is actively promoting various policies. In particular, Japan is advancing two major projects, that is TSMC Kumamoto and Rapidus. So I will assess the validity of these two projects from the perspective of economic security. Then finally, I would like to make a conclusion. This is all what I'm talking about from now. Okay, let's move to the first issue. So economic security in Japan. So first of all, I would like to briefly explain the post-war development of Japan's economy. So the Pacific War ended in 1945. And after that, Japan rebuilt its economic system under the guidance of U.S. forces. And soon after, as you know well, the Korean War broke out in 1950. Then fortunately, this war brought significant demand to the Japanese economy. And then Japan then achieved a rapid economic recovery using the Korean War as a catalyst. In the 1960s, Japan entered a period of rapid economic growth. Against the backdrop of rapidly rising wages, we enjoyed affluent consumption. However, the economic situation changed after the 1970s. So following two oil crises, the economy entered a recessionary period. During these crises, we experienced the shortage of oil-related products. And then this forced the Japanese government to seriously consider economic security for the first time in the history. However, the discussion at that time remained how to procure the natural resources. We did not discuss a comprehensive strategy for economic security. And then following that, we enjoyed the prosperity of bubble economy. So the bubble economy basically lasted from 1986 to 1991. However, after the bubble economy collapsed, we entered the so-called lost decades era. So during this period, we also experienced a great East Japan earthquake, which took place in 2011. And we also have suffered from a prolonged economic downturn brought by a severe deflation. But the situation that changed when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe took office in 2012. The Prime Minister promoted his economic policy, so-called Abenomics. Then after that, Japanese economy began returning to the growth trajectory. However, in the early 2020s, the COVID-19 pandemic suddenly spread, and the business activities and our way of life were forced to adapt to this pandemic. So during the pandemic, also demand for information and communications technology products such as a PC, tablet, or internet system, or Zoom system, this demand surged dramatically, and it is leading to a significant shortage of the semiconductor. Then furthermore, economic friction between China and the U.S. Took place in the late 2010s and escalated into a contest for hegemony in high-tech industries, including semiconductor. So against the backdrop of this pandemic and unstable geopolitical conditions, the Japanese government recognized the importance of economic security once again, and particularly regarding the resilience of semiconductor supply chains. As a result, the Japanese government began taking various measures, such as enacting relevant legislation. And the current Takaichi administration also maintains this basic policy on economic security. So this is the overall history of Japanese economic development, including economic security. So once again, in the next page, let's briefly review our history of post-war economic development and especially consider when economic security gained attention in Japan. So the first time economic security gained attention in Japan was during the oil crisis. However, I mentioned before, discussions at that time remained focused on securing the procurement of oil and oil-related products, so without addressing a comprehensive strategy for economic security. Then second time when economic security is paid attention in Japan, it's the current pandemic era. So we have realized that supply chains have become globally integrated, and it becomes vulnerable when pandemics occur or geopolitical conditions become unstable. Also, we have recognized the semiconductor is subject to target of hegemony between U.S. and China. Then, against this backdrop, subsequently, Japanese government is taking relevant measures. First of all, in December 2020, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a leading party in Japan, Liberal Democratic Party released one policy document. whose title is Proposal Toward the Development of Japan's Economic Security Strategy. And this document outlines fundamental principles and approaches. So when we discuss Japan's economic security, we definitely should refer to this document. And after that, so Kishida administration took office in October 2021, and this administration established the position of Minister for Economic Security for the first time. And after that, so May 2022, so-called Economic Security Promotion Act enacted in Japan. This law provided a legal basis for related policies and their implementation. And subsequently, a government has implemented various economic policies and measures under the slogan, under the Economic Security Promotion Act, including comprehensive support for the semiconductor industry. Then the Japanese government is currently implementing specific measures concerning economic security, not only for semiconductor, but also across various industries, including food security and energy securities. Then, so let's take a look at the next page. So in this page, I would like to explain the essence of LDP policy research report and the essence of our Economic Security Promotion Act. First of all, please take a look at upper part of the picture. So the LDP report outlines two key concepts of economic security. That is strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability. So as you can see here, this is a kind of step-by-step process. So you can find the sequence between two factors. So the first step is, of course, creating a strategic autonomy. And once we created strategic autonomy, so we can go forward to the next step. So creating strategic indispensability. For example, if nothing exists in Japan at the moment, the first task is to create a strategic autonomy for that. So regarding the semiconductor industry, so the current level of process scaling in Japan is very behind to the rival companies. That's why what we should do is to create strategic autonomy at first. And next, let's take a look at the below part of the picture. So here are the four major objectives of the Economic Security Promotion Act. So at first, the stable supply of critical materials, this issue is prescribed in Economic Security Promotion Act. And after that, we have ensuring safety of critical infrastructure, supporting the development of advanced critical technologies. And finally, we have a patent non-disclosure system. So as you can see here, the stable supply of critical material, this phrase is firstly prescribed in the Economic Security Promotion Act. That's why we can understand this is the most important factor agenda among these four objectives. Then next, take a look at the government support for the semiconductor industry. In fact, various measures have been implemented since 2022. But among these measures, the project that deserve particular attention here are the TSMC Kumamoto, the project of TSMC Kumamoto and Rapidus. So I will discuss the details later, but now I would like to explain that TSMC Kumamoto has already commenced its mass production. And while Rapidus is still in the process of constructing its factory, and Rapidus plans to begin its production in 2027. Okay? there is a time gap between the project of TSMC and Rapidus in Hokkaido. And please take a look at the below half of the picture. So here you can find why the semiconductor has been designated as a strategic materials. Basically, we have three reasons regarding the importance of semiconductor. So first reason is that IC chips are used in various products and systems, and therefore it has become indispensable devices for our daily life. And moreover, the semiconductor has so-called dual use. Dual use means civilian use and military use. That's why the semiconductor is also important in the context of national defense. And finally, so looking at the advanced logic IC segment, the production of the advanced logic IC basically is concentrating on a certain region and countries, such as South Korea and Taiwan. That's why so its supply chain could be disrupted once something happens on the supply chain. So this is the third reason why the semiconductor is so important in economic security. Okay, so then let's move on to the next issue, that is a development process of Japan's semiconductor industry. So before talking about the current situation, so it's better for us to quickly review about the history of Japan's economics, Japan's semiconductor industry. So I have summarized the history in one page. So I think this table is very useful for you to understand overall the situation. So I think the development process could be divided into 4 phases. First phase is post-war to the 1970s. This is a down period. So during this period, Japan primarily introduced technology from the United States and developed its own products. One notable event in this period was Sony's successful invention of its own transistor radio. So Sony began selling transistor radio in 1955. So another groundbreaking event was the collaboration between industry, academia, and the government to launch the LSI and the VLSI project. LSI means large scale IC, and the VLSI, very large scale IC. So this initiative produced significant results and created the foundation for further development of Japan's semiconductor industry. The second stage was the 1980s. We can call this period as a golden age. So because Japan successfully exercised the high competitiveness especially in DRAM market, and the share of Japan was over 50% in total market of semiconductor in the late 1980s. One of the characteristics which could explain the competitiveness of Japanese company in this period was IDM. IDM means the integrated device manufacturing. This is the name of business model. So as you can see from the name of IDM, this is a kind of a vertical integration business model. So that means for everything one company is doing. In case of the semiconductor, one company is doing from design, manufacturing, testing, packaging, and even incorporation to the final products. So this is one of the resources to explain the competitiveness of Japanese companies in 1980s. But this overwhelming performance caused complaint from U.S. side. As a result, Japan was forced to make a U.S.-Japan semiconductor treaty in 1986, which was very unfair for Japan. So then the Japanese industry enters the next stage. So this is a period of declining. Actually, not only for semiconductor, but also everything mostly began declining in 1990s in Japan, you know. Then, so in this period, so on the other hand, the Korean and the Taiwanese company was started rising. And for example, so Korean Samsung detected the shift of market trend and occupied a high market share in PC DRAM segment. And TSMC adopted a unique business model, so-called foundry business model, and occupied a high market share in foundry segment. On the other hand, Japan still, because the Japanese economy, so bubble economy collapsed, then Japanese company overall lost its financial capability and couldn't make an investment to develop the next generation technology. So next phase is after 2000. This is a period of restructuring. So in this period, so many Japanese major electronics company conduct a restructuring and spun off its semiconductor divisions. Then, so this spun off semiconductor divisions so consolidated into one so dedicated semiconductor company. The representative examples are LPDA memory and Renesas technology. So LPDA memory was producing DRAM and was the last company producing DRAM in Japan. But unfortunately, you know, this company went to bankrupt in 2012. And Renesas technology produces logic IC, including LSI. And Renesas technology, this company was facing with a lot of difficulties, but can survive to the present. And also Japanese company dropped out from the competition of process scaling. Then basically withdrew from the process scaling and stagnated at 40 nanometer for logic IC technology. On the other hand, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment and the materials industry has maintained competitiveness in Japan. So this is a characteristics in the period of restructuring. So that is a summary of the development process of Japanese semiconductor industry. Then let's go to the next page. So from here, take a look at the current position of Japanese semiconductor industry by looking at the various statistics. So we will look at the several statistics and confirm the current position of the Japanese semiconductor industry. So figure 1, this is showing the market size of each sectors, each segment. So as you can see here, the logic IC, the market size of logic IC is over 300 billion at the moment. So this is the largest segment in the semiconductor, logic IC. And the function of logic IC is here. So it performs a calculation like a CPU or GPU. These are logic IC. And memory sector, the market size is 150 billion. This is just half to the market size of logic IC. And you can understand that logic IC and memory both are two major segments in semiconductor. And for other types, such as analog IC or power discrete IC or sensor IC, the market size less than 50 billion US dollars. It's comparatively small market size. So next page, I think this table is also very important and valuable. So this is a roadmap of development of process scaling. So first of all, so I would like to explain the importance of process scaling in the semiconductor. So process scaling it's the most crucial factor defining the technology level of IC chip. So more specifically, the smaller the figure is, the more advanced the IC chip becomes, because you can place more transistors in the same square. And as a result, you can achieve a calculation with a higher speed. That's why this process scaling is very important. But in order to develop your process scaling, you need huge investment. That's why someone says the competition of process scaling is a competition of financial capability. So as you can see here, in the early 2000s, all companies, including Japanese companies, were engaged in a competition of process scaling. However, by the mid 2000s, some companies withdrew from the process scaling competition, and also Japanese companies dropped out from the competition at the 32 nanometer level in early 2010s. Process scaling below 10 nanometer after 2016, so the process scale reached the level below 10 nanometer. So below 10 nanometer is particularly challenging, and it requires massive investment. And this roadmap shows even Intel or Samsung, these companies are struggling with process scaling below 5 nanometer. So at present, TSMC is the only company which has successfully mass-produced 2 nanometer logic IC. Okay. This is the overall situation of process scaling. Then, next page also is talking about process scaling of logic IC. So this page is showing market share of producing countries by process scaling segments of logic IC. So regarding the matured segment like 10 to 32 nanometer or over 40 nanometer, basically production countries are basically diverse. Therefore, the structure of supply chain could be expected relatively stable, even if something happens on the supply chain. On the other hand, please take a look at 10 nanometer, below 10 nanometer. So regarding the advanced segment less than 10 nanometer, so the production countries are limited, namely Korea, Taiwan, and the US, only 3 countries or regions. So therefore, we have a concern that supply chain becomes unstable once something like a geopolitical problem happens. And especially regarding the cutting edge technology, such as 2 nanometer or 3 nanometer, the production site essentially concentrate on Taiwan, only one region. So once Taiwan contingency happens, so we are afraid that the supply chain will be disrupted and the production using 2 nanometer will totally stop in the world. So we are facing this kind of situation now. Then next page, this is also a statistics, sorry. So, but these statistics are very important to understand the current position of Japan. So this statistics is describing the market share of major companies by segments of semiconductors. At first, please look at the upper left side. So logic IC processor. So in this sector, so you can understand US companies like NVIDIA, Apple, Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom. These companies have a high market share. All of them are US companies. And the below segment, microcontroller. In this segment, you can find some European companies or Japanese companies. And the below, there is a foundries. Foundries means focus on manufacturing, contract manufacturing. So in this segment, so Taiwan holds over 70%. And one company, TSMC, is accounting for 65%. So big presence of Taiwan in this segment. And meanwhile, please take a look at the right side, upper right side. You can find the situation of memory. The function of memory is to store the information. In this segment, you can find the big presence of Korean companies, such as Samsung, SK Hynix, and followed by U.S. company, Micron. And also you can find the name of Japanese company in the segment of NAND flash memory. So this is a Kioxia. So Kioxia is the former Toshiba memory. Actually, the NAND flash memory, this device was invented by Japanese engineer working at Toshiba memory. And then finally, looking at the analog segment, in this segment, you can find a lot of names of Japanese companies. However, the market size of analog IC is not so big, okay? As we have seen before. So go back to this graph. So these are analog IC. Then total market size is very small compared to that of logic IC or memory, okay? Then finally, please take a look at this graph. This is a market share of countries in manufacturing equipment and materials. Memory, this is the upstream industries, okay? In this segment, as you can see here, so Japan holds a large market share in both segments, manufacturing equipment and materials. So although Japan has lost its competitiveness in IC chip design and manufacturing, but still keep competitiveness in upstream industries. So let me summarize the current position of Japan's semiconductor industry. There are 5 points here. First point, logic IC process scaling technology remains at the 14 nanometer process level. It is equivalent to the standard in 2010. And the second point, so Japan does not take part in the International Division of Labor System for logic IC, so-called fabless foundry division of labor system. And as a third point, Japan has a minor presence in the sector of NAND flash memory and power IC, but the market size of these segments are small. And number 4, Sony, this company holds a large market share in image sensor IC chip, but its market size is also small. And finally, as we have seen right now, just Japan continues to maintain a large market share in the upstream industries. This is a summary of the current position. Then, so now let's move on to the final agenda, the validity of the semiconductor industry revitalization strategy. So actually, the Japanese government now is progressing many support to the semiconductor industry, but especially TSMC Kumamoto and Rapidus are 2 major symbolic projects. So that's why I would like to focus on the 2 projects and examine their significance in terms of economic security. So here's an overview of 2 projects. So TSMC Kumamoto, this company was established in November 2021. The operating company is JASM, Japan Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing. This is the name of the operating company. We simply call it as JASM, okay? JASM. And the stakeholders of the operation company are TSMC, Sony, Denso, and Toyota. And there are 2 factories at TSMC Kumamoto. The first factory already started its mass production in the end of 2024. The factory is producing 12 to 28 nanometer. Meanwhile, the target industry of the first factory producing IC chip are automobile, industrial equipment, and consumer electronics. And these industrial clusters already exist in Kyushu region. This is a very important point. And meanwhile, the second factory is going to begin production of 3 nanometer IC chip in 2022. The target industries are data center, AI server, and smartphones. So probably, I think a part of IC will be exported from the second factory because there is not this kind of industrial foundation in Kyushu. And the technology support is coming from TSMC in Taiwan. Okay? This is the overall overview of the project of TSMC. The second project is a Rapidus in Hokkaido. So Rapidus was established in August 2022, and 8 Japanese companies are providing capital to Rapidus. The factory is currently underway of construction in Chitose City, Hokkaido. Then Rapidus plans to begin production of cutting-edge 2 nanometer IC chip in 2027. Then technical support will be provided by U.S. IBM and the European Research Institute, IMEC. Then Rapidus already succeeded the trial production of 2 nanometer last year. And the target industries include AI servers, data centers, and smartphones. These are there, but there are almost no industrial basement using this kind of advanced IC chip in Hokkaido. Therefore, I think basically the IC chip produced by Rapidus will be exported as well as the product by second factory in TSMC Kumamoto. Then in the next page, so this page explains the fundraising status of 2 projects. Fundraising is very important to promote this project. So first of all, so regarding TSMC Kumamoto, it is said that 2 trillion Japanese yen is required for the plant to reach full operation. Then so far, the government has already spent 1.2 trillion yen. That means 60% of the investment is financed by the Japanese government. And meanwhile, talking about Rapidus, so totally 5 trillion Japanese yen is required to achieve mass production of 2 nanometer IC chip. Then the government has already spent 1.77 trillion. So this means 1/3 of the financed by Japanese government. So as we understand here, so substantial public funds have been invested in both projects. Notably for Rapidus, it amounts to, notably Rapidus, that despite the scale of public funding being larger than for TSMC Kumamoto, it amounts to only 1/3 of the required investment. And furthermore, the project still not reached to the mass production, still in the process of the construction of the factory. So the president of Rapidus, currently he said, he is going to procure private money as much as possible for the investment. But however, I'm afraid that more public money will be spent to Rapidus in next couple of years. So here you can find a lot of criticism to the 2 projects. Actually, both projects have faced significant criticism so far. First of all, regarding TSMC, so there are criticisms that the government, why the government is providing subsidies to a foreign-owned company. So as I have explained just now, The operating company is JASM, and the JASM is a joint venture of Taiwan and Japan. So this is a foreign-owned company. Moreover, the 80% of stake is held by TSMC. So there is a criticism why the government is spending money to the foreign-owned company. And furthermore, regarding TSMC Kumamoto, there is another criticism that it doesn't contribute to enhancing supply chain resilience because front-end mask design manufacturing and back-end processes will continue to be performed in Taiwan. So namely, even though we have a TSMC Kumamoto, a part of the process still continue to be performed outside of Japan. So this is another criticism for TSMC Kumamoto. On the other hand, the Rapidus has a lot of criticism and concerns. For example, someone says, Rapidus is a startup company. However, it doesn't have its own technological foundation. So normally, startup company should have its own technological background. But Rapidus doesn't have any background, just depend on the technology of IBM or IMEC. So this is the first point criticized by specialists. And the second criticism, some analysts argued that it is very reckless for Rapidus to aim for mass production of 2 nanometer immediately because, as I have already explained, the current level of process scaling in Japan is 14 nanometer. That is the standard of 2010. But now immediately jump up to 2 nanometer. It seems like, the baseball player at junior high school tries to play in major league, okay? So this is very reckless. This is the second point for criticism for Rapidus. And another criticism also existing, so Rapidus does not disclose its target customers, and Rapidus officially announces the company is going to avoid mass production-driven strategy, regardless that the semiconductor is equipment industry. Actually, so to produce the semiconductor, it needs a huge initial investment. So this is the equipment industry. That's why how to achieve a scale of economy is very critical for the semiconductor company to survive. But the Rapidus officially announces the company is going to avoid mass production-driven tech strategy. This is another point for criticism. And looking at, and also there is another criticism. So if you look at the relation between two projects, these two projects looks like progressing independently. That means there seems no interaction between two projects. And more specifically, looking at the location of these projects, TSMC is located in Kyushu, the southern part of Japan. And Rapidus is building its factory in Hokkaido, that is the northern part of Japan. The distance between two places is over 2,000 kilometers. So it is very difficult to create some interaction or linkage between two projects. So it also looks inefficient. This is another criticism. Then, so as we reviewed so far, there are a lot of criticism and concern regarding the two projects. However, no research has been conducted from the perspective of economic security. So I think it is worthwhile investigating from the standpoint of economic security because the significant public money has spent to the both projects. So I would like to investigate how much the both projects are going to contribute to our economic security in Japan. This is a main research question of my study. And to investigate this research question, what I should do at first is to elaborate the definition of economic security. If the definition of economic security obscure, perhaps I cannot produce meaningful output. So how to define the economic security? Regarding the definition of economic security, I would like to define it as a supply chain resilience. This is because the policy paper issued by LDP mentions two core concepts of economic security. That is a strategic autonomy and strategic indispensability. I think that both concepts deeply relate with supply chain of strategic material. And furthermore, in Economic Security Promotion Act, the first issue prescribed in this act is stable supply of critical materials. Therefore, I here define the essence of economic security in Japan as supply chain resilience. Then I would like to present my research framework here. So this is a very simplified supply chain of semiconductor. So there are only three processes. So namely materials and semiconductor. This is the upstream process, and the design and the manufacturing. This is the midstream, and the final product. This is the downstream. So actually, the real supply chain of semiconductor is much more complicated. But now, in order to explain briefly and simply, so I dare to simplify the supply chain like this. So I would like to beg your understanding for this point. So at first, please look at the upper half of the picture. So this is a case that there is only one company in each process. In this case, the supply chain is very weak, vulnerable, because the supply chain goes to disruption, even if one of the companies stops its operation. Then next, please look at the below half of the picture. So this indicates that a new company enters in midstream industry, that is IC chip design and manufacturing. Then what we should pay attention to here is that new entry, this brings benefit to upstream and downstream industries. This is because the upstream industries will have a new clients due to the entry of new company in middle segment. In other words, sales channel of the upstream industries will be diversified. Similarly, it will bring also benefit to downstream industries because supplier increase and the downstream industries have a multiple option for its procurement. Then finally, what happens in the middle stream? In the middle stream, it is more competitive due to the entry of newcomer. Okay, this is a very simple framework. Then, so based on this framework, so I got a case study, and this is the result of the case study for the TSMC Kumamoto. So as you can see here, the commencement of operations at TSMC Kumamoto basically has completed our supply chain in Japan. The upstream industries in Japan can now supply their products to TSMC Kumamoto, while downstream industries can procure IC chip from TSMC Kumamoto. For example, Sony has established an image sensor factory near TSMC Kumamoto, first factory. I think this is a very symbolic event for completion of supply chain. On the other hand, the operation of TSMC Kumamoto is also supported by both upstream and downstream industries. As a result, the goal of strengthening the supply chain resilience, a crucial pillar of economic security, is now seen as highly achievable in case of TSMC Kumamoto. Overall, there are industrial clusters such as automobile, industrial equipment, or consumer electronics in Kyushu, and moreover, upstream industries are also already existing in Japan, including Kyushu. That's why so we can expect that industrial linkage will be generating due to the operation of TSMC Kumamoto. This is my conclusion for the case study of Kumamoto. Then in next page, so this is a case study of Rapidus. So at first, what I would like to say here is that downstream industries using 2 nanometer IC chip do not exist, not only in Hokkaido, but also in entire Japan at the moment. The main user of 2 nanometer IC chip is AI server, data center, and smartphones. U.S. companies are basically competitive in these sectors. Therefore, so U.S. companies can be benefited by the entry of Rapidus in the advanced semiconductor sector because their options of procurement increase. So before the Rapidus, they had to procure only from TSMC. But due to the entry of Rapidus, they will have another option to procurement. They can compete to TSMC and Rapidus. Okay? So this is a benefit for US company operating in downstream industries. And on the other hand, of course, Rapidus will bring benefit to procurement, will bring benefit to Japanese upstream industries. So because Rapidus will purchase equipment materials. However, there is almost no upstream industrial foundations in Hokkaido. And furthermore, so regarding one important machinery, EUV lithography, which is indispensable machinery to produce cutting edge 2 nanometer or 3 nanometer. So as for this machinery, so Japan currently cannot produce. So there is only one company which can produce EUV. This is a Dutch company, ASML. So, and so the Rapidus so has to depend on the procurement of EUV, has to depend on ASML for the procurement of EUV. And moreover, so at the moment, the production capacity of EUV by ASML is much less than its order. That means the demand for EUV is over its supply capacity. Therefore, Rapidus has to compete with TSMC and Samsung for procurement of EUV. Overall, the case of Rapidus is a kind of Japan's new entry of the supply chain of the advanced semiconductor, where Japan had not been involved in. So in contrast with the case of the TSMC Kumamoto, I think the case of Rapidus seems to make less contribution to supply chain resilience, regardless so much public money has been spent to the project. Okay, this is the conclusion of my presentation. So my presentation covers several key points. First point, Japan's semiconductor industry lost its competitiveness in the 1990s due to misjudging market trends and changing in the external environment. And also Japan dropped out from the process scaling competition. Its technology level remains at 40 nanometer, which is equivalent with the standard of 2010. And against this backdrop, the semiconductor shortage that emerged in 2020 prompted the Japanese government to recognize the necessity of revitalizing the semiconductor industry and as a slogan of economic security. And this is leading to the launch of 2 major projects, TSMC Kumamoto and Rapidus. And then I have conducted comparative analysis from the viewpoint of economic security, and I have revealed the significant differences regarding the outcomes of the 2 projects. In case of the TSMC Kumamoto, overall, industrial linkage has been created with Japan's equipment and material industries, as well as with the downstream industries. And overall, the project is expected to enhance the resilience of the domestic supply chain. On the other hand, Rapidus was judged to strongly suggest Japan's entry into the global supply chain of the advanced logic IC, an area Japan had not previously been involved in, rather than primarily focusing on enhancing the domestic supply chain resilience. So finally, I would like to emphasize, I don't have any intention to deny the significance of Rapidus. However, I believe the project of Rapidus should be operated in line with the original purpose of economic security, as long as the government is spending a huge money to the project. So my research is still ongoing, and this conclusion is not completed. It's a kind of interim conclusion. So I would like to welcome your comments and questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
Really, really interesting. When I was at the embassy, we were visiting Rapidus and very involved in Rapidus because of the U.S. interest. So you raised a whole bunch of really fascinating issues. It seems to me that everything you do in semiconductors is so forward-leaning, and so you have to be creative and you have to pivot. And so there are a couple of places that it seems Japan could. So for example, with TSMC, couldn't Japan start doing the back end work? And for Rapidus, Japan already makes the manufacturing equipment for the wafers and already does some of the EUV type machines. Couldn't Japan end up building the Netherlands model? I know it's higher tech, but possibly. And also, couldn't Japanese industry start using those 2 nanometers? And it could be a boost for Japan's electronics industry. Or is that just too much of a reach? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for your comment. So I personally hope the success of the Rapidus project, and after the operation of Rapidus, so 2 nanometer would be a trigger to boost the Japanese electronics industry. But on the other hand, I have a concern. At the moment, the downstream industry using 2 nanometer basically doesn't exist in Japan. And major clients, all of the major clients are locating in United States. That's why, so you know, I hope there would be a linkage between the operation of Rapidus and the Japanese electronics industry, but it will take a time, maybe take 10 years or 15 years. And then I'm afraid the Rapidus can survive in next 10 years or 15 years. That is my concerning point. Thank you so much.
So I have a couple questions. So the conclusion is that TSMC in Kumamoto is in pretty good shape. And I think most people, observers, would probably agree with that. It was a very smart strategy to start with a the lower end and then go to the higher 3 to 4 nanometers. So Rapidus, I had a chance to hear from the president of Rapidus over the summer, and he was facing similar criticisms. So a couple things that I wonder if I'm not an expert, so I wonder how you feel about this. Upstream, so EUV, my understanding is it's a huge machine that you need, and I think Rapidus purchased 2 of them, right, from ASML. You don't need that many of that, right? So upstream supply chain, once you get them, you don't need to buy one every month or anything like that. So is it kind of a different kinds of upstream supply chain than, say, wafer or chemicals to clean up and that kind of stuff? So that might mean that the problem that you pointed out may not matter too much for Rapidus. And then downstream, I think Canon just agreed to purchase 2 nano from Rapidus. So in the future, as Kemi alluded to, if the industry grows that would use 2 nanometers, which I hope, that probably needs to happen at some point, then it will be in better shape. So how would you respond to that Rapidus spokesperson would say something like this. And how would you respond to that? That's question number one. Number two, you pointed out that Kumamoto was already a hub of the semiconductor industry. And I don't know too much about the history of Kikuyocho development. I happened to be there over the summer, and it's a great development right now with all these industry, supply chain, upstream, down, everything is there. But was it like that before TSMC? I got the impression that people talk about how the real estate price kind of shot up after TSMC decided to move there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all these companies that are now there, I don't know if they didn't exist prior to that. So I'm wondering how to what extent it was true that before TSMC came, Kumamoto was a hub. And if it wasn't, then Rapidus Chitose area also has the potential to become like Kikuyocho.
Okay, so as for the first question, so the relation between upstream and the downstream. So as for the upstream industry, so of course, so the overall materials or equipment, so Japan basically provide to Rapidus. That's why so Rapidus, if the Rapidus purchases these machinery or materials from Japanese companies, it will generate a positive effect to their business. But so EUV is the indispensable machinery to produce 2 nanometer. That's why so without EUV, so Rapidus cannot produce any IC chip. That's why so Rapidus definitely has to purchase EUV. And as you said, so this machinery is very expensive. So 1 unit is 30 billion to 40 billion. And also at the moment, so TSMC or Samsung or even Intel are also very eager to purchase EUV from ASML. Under this situation, so Rapidus should compete with these rivals for the procurement of EUV. So I think this could be a big bottleneck for the business of Rapidus. So this is my concern. At the moment, I know so the Rapidus has 2 unit EUV, but so 2 unit is just for the trial production in the last year. And then, so if the Rapidus would like to enhance its stage to the mass production, maybe so Rapidus should have more EUV. I'm not sure how much units are needed to produce so-called mass production, but maybe 5 or 10 units are needed. I think so. So it's a bit difficult to procure so this EUV through the competition with TSMC or Samsung. This is my question. This is my answer to your first question. And as for the second question regarding the downstream industries, so now I have criticized, overall, I have criticized Rapidus in my presentation, but on the other hand, I feel one possibility for the business of Rapidus in near future. This is a possibility that the Rapidus is providing its 2 nanometer to automobile sectors in Japan. So at the moment, so what the most important technology development in automobile sector is autonomous driving. And in order to realize autonomous driving, the cutting edge IC chip like 2 nanometer is of course needed. And maybe the potential demand for the cutting edge IC chip is very huge from automobile sector. That's why one of the possibility is the interaction between the operation of Rapidus and automobile sector. In this point, I personally expect Japanese government will take an initiative to connect Rapidus and the Japanese automobile sector. I'm not sure I'm replying to your question, but this is my answer to your second question.
Kumamoto? Question, was it a big hub?
Right.
Before TSMC?
Yes, well, yeah. So before TSMC coming, Kumamoto was already a big hub of semiconductor. Yeah, we call Silicon Island. Basically, we can call Kyushu area, including Kumamoto, as a Silicon Island before TSMC Kumamoto coming. That's why so there was already industrial basement in Kumamoto. And then so TSMC advanced into Kumamoto. That's why immediately the linkage has been generating. This is my understanding.
Question. So probably just following Kyo's questions regarding a concern of overcapacity. Because now every country is focusing on sort of economic security and building all these, high volume or high capital-driven enterprises. So not in Japan, but also in the U.S. as well. Intel, they have a large, wave fab in Arizona, and China is also, building a lot of, big plants. It seems the government have the deep pocket. So I'm concerned that, do we need really these, chips? So in 10 years, maybe these, chips will be over capacity globally. And the history of economy tend to suggest that all these government sort of subsidized industries will fail eventually. So that's sort of a observation, because everybody is talking about the wafer fab, chips, the security. And it's a huge investment. So that's probably just, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment. Actually, I have a similar concern regarding overcapacity, especially the segment of the advanced IC chip like 2 nanometer. So as a matter of fact, the TSMC Kumamoto, so there are 2 factories. And the first factory is producing 12 to 28 nanometer. This is a matured segment. This doesn't overlap with the segment of 2 nanometer. Then the second factory, in the past time, second factory planned to produce 6 to 7 nanometer. But the company recently changed its plan. Then at the moment, the second factory is going to produce 3 to 4 nanometer. This is one generation behind to 2 nanometer, but the target industry are almost the same. In this sense, so maybe a kind of overcapacity will be appearing in near future. And under this situation, I'm afraid Rapidus can survive through the competition with TSMC or Korean Samsung, because technology basement is very unstable for the Rapidus. Yeah, I have the same concern.
Sean, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I know you are very good golfer, but also good scholar about the industry, semiconductor industry in Japan. First of all, on the page of the conclusion, you said that the Japanese government made a misjudgment about industry first bullet. That's the government misjudgment or the industries and private companies misjudgment?
Sorry, which part are you talking about?
First bullet.
First paragraph. Japan's semiconductor due to a misjudgment of market trends. Okay. This is a misjudgment of private companies,
yes,
not the government.
Yes.
Especially in 1990s. Actually, in 1980s, so Japanese private companies were very competitive in the DRAM market. And in 1980s, the main outlet of DRAM is mainframe computer. But in 1990s, the outlet of DRAM was shifting from mainframe to personal computer. But the Japanese company could not detect this market trend. And then instead of Japanese companies, so Samsung or SK Hynix, so began to occupy the market of DRAM, especially in PC market. This is the meaning of misjudgment.
Okay, so second question is, I have interest in the Japanese developed states, changes and continuity of the development state in Japan. So could you say that if there is a kind of the similarities and differences between the 1970s Japanese development state and current government policy for industrial boosting of semiconductor? Is any kinds of the changes and continuity between the 1970s?
You mean so regarding the Japanese government's policy?
Yes. So
Okay.
in 1970s, Japan's government the lead industrial policy in many. So as you said, that's a conceptualized the Japan's development state. So now Japan, as far as I understand, you said to me that Japan's government should innovate industrial policy in semiconductor.
Okay.
So is there any kinds of the differences and continuity of that?
Actually, sorry, I have never checked the changing of Japanese government's policies from timeline from 1970s to the present. That's why, so I cannot compare the each period in terms of Japanese economic policies. But basically, this is my basic principle. So basically, I think the government should not intervene excessively the market, because if the government intervene excessively in the market, it will cause some negative side effect. So especially regarding economic security. So economic security is regarding economic activities. And I think the main players of economic activities are private companies, not the government. In this sense, I think so sometimes the Japanese government should take an initiative, but on the other hand, the Japanese government should be careful not to intervene excessively in the market. This is my fundamental way of thinking.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I just want to follow up on actually the two answers. I think regarding the location of the factory, I'm just wondering why they pick Hokkaido instead of Kyoto down where all the other factories are. And secondly, regarding the market issue, I think, and I don't know the history of TSMC, but I'm wondering if the Taiwan government in the 2020s or late 2010s actually, funded that 2 nanometer and the 3 and 4 nanometer factories in Taiwan, in which case there's good precedence for the U.S. and Japan, China, to also fund their, help their private industry, because it's a very capital intensive project to build a 2-3 nanometer factory production.
Okay, so
regarding the EUV, and just wondering if that technology is licensable so that Japan or U.S. or China can actually make their own machines.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. First of all, regarding the first question, why the Rapidus is building its factory in Hokkaido? I think so. To answer this question, I have to contact the person who is in charge of the project. But I guess one of the reasons why, especially the government has chosen Hokkaido, not Kyushu, this is because the government would like to stimulate local economy of Hokkaido through the project. The local economy of Hokkaido is relatively behind compared to the average of Japan. So I think so if the government also choose Kyushu as a production site of Rapidus, in this case, maybe in terms of economic effectiveness, so it will bring a positive effect. So if the factory of Rapidus also in Kyushu, there could be a synergy effect and ecosystem also will be generating. But in this case, perhaps people living other area maybe will complain. Why is the government prioritizing only Kyushu? Okay, so maybe the government consider this this kind of fairness of public policy, then has chosen the Hokkaido. This is my answer to first question. And sorry, what is the second question?
The second question was, I'm trying to remember, regarding the EUV. Actually, that was the third question. I'm still thinking of the second one. The EUV, if that's licensable technology, build that.
Yeah. So you mean, so in near future, Japan or US can produce EUV domestically, right?
Right.
Okay. As far as I understand, EUV is a kind of precision machinery. And, you know, in the field of precision machinery, overall, Japan is very competitive. But even Japan cannot produce EUV. That means the production process of EUV is very, very difficult, as far as I understand. And I also heard from my friend working at TSMC. So how to use the EUV is also very difficult. So TSMC or Samsung to have a EUV for the training or practicing for engineering, for engineer. Then engineer practice many times how to use EUV, and then finally they can use EUV to produce. In this sense, so EUV, this machinery, production and usage, both are very difficult. That's why, so I'm afraid in near future, Japan cannot produce this EUV. This is my perspective.
In the factory in Taiwan, initial 2 nanometer factory, did they get investment from the government, or they did it all on their own, raising private capital?
Well, yeah, of course. So every government of every country provide more or less subsidies to semiconductor industry. So I have never searched, but I guess Taiwanese government also provided subsidies to some extent to the semiconductor industry. And talking about Taiwanese semiconductor industry, so I have one more thing to emphasize here. In Taiwan, there is an N-1 regulation, N-1 rule. That means the production outside of Taiwan by Taiwanese company should be 1 generation behind to the production in Taiwan. For example, so the TSMC in Arizona, it is going to produce 3 nanometer, and it is 1 generation behind 2 nanometer produced in Taiwan. And in near future, perhaps TSMC Arizona is going to produce 2 nanometer, but at that time, the production in Taiwan will be enhanced to the next stage. For example, 1.6 nanometer or 1.4 nanometer. This is a unique industrial policy by Taiwanese government. And I think this policy makes contribution to keep Taiwan's leading position in the semiconductor industry.
Thank you. A great presentation. I have been thinking about the potential hold-up problems in the operation phase. And I have 2 specific questions about that. For example, in the operation phase, is it possible that the TSMC stop providing technology? I don't know the details of a license agreement, but if those, so is it about the relationship between Taiwan and Japan, as well as for Rapidus, relationship between Japan and the U.S. Is it possible for them to stop providing technology in the operation phase? That's one. The other second hold-up problem I think of is about the regional economy as well. So if those, I wonder if those projects produce so much effect on local economy. If those local economies, Hokkaido and Kyushu, heavily depend on these projects, then those local economies face hold-up problem. When something bad happens to those projects, they are willing to provide extra money. So can you provide intuition to those?
Okay, thank you so much for your question. First of all, regarding the first question, is there any possibility that the TSMC or IBM stops technological provision to the company? So regarding the TSMC Kumamoto, as I mentioned in my presentation, the majority stake is held by TSMC. I think the percentage of stake is over 80%. In this sense, I think there is a few possibilities that TSMC will stop assistance to TSMC Kumamoto as long as the current capital structure keeps. On the other hand, so the relation between Rapidus and IBM. So first of all, so what we have to remind is that the technology that Rapidus is providing to Rapidus is just a fundamental technology, not mass production technology. So this is a different point regarding between the TSMC and the Rapidus. TSMC provide a full support, including fundamental and mass production technology. But IBM is providing only fundamental technology. So in other words, regarding mass production technology, Rapidus should deal with by itself. So I'm not sure about what the contract has been between two companies, but I think there's no possibility that IBM stops providing fundamental technology. And even if it stops, so mass production technology, so Rapidus should deal with by itself. I think so. In the regional economy in Kyushu, maybe there could be a big effect brought by TSMC project, because so, as I mentioned before, in Kyushu, there were already existing industries, supporting industries. That's why, so after TSMC came to Kyushu, the industrial linkage immediately were generating. On the other hand, actually, the Rapidus is in the process of construction of factory. So I'm not sure the real situation, what's going on. But in Hokkaido, there is a few existing industries. That's why so industrial linkage or effect for local economy basically it's only depending on only the project of Rapidus. In this sense, the structure is more vulnerable in case of Rapidus.
Great. Thank you. This was very, very informative and insightful. Thank you very much, Professor Akabane. Thank you.